Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This video is about the writings of Chuang. So this is a Taoist text, and in the introductory paragraph, Richard Bilsker says Chuang 370 to 301 BCE is usually referred to as the second of the great Taoists. So the first great Taoist was Lao Tzu, or Lao Zi, I guess, since it's spelled the same way. And this is the second great Taoist, and we'll be comparing the Tao Te Ching to the writings of Chuang in one of these discussion questions. So like the Tao Te Ching, it's not written as a continuous essay. It's a series of little aphorisms that are loosely connected. And it seems to me a little more connected than the Tao Te Ching, meaningfully sequenced, but at the same time you could read them out of order and they would still be self-consistent paragraphs. So that is something to keep in mind. So kind of a from beginning to end analysis, like with some of the readings, makes sense, but not so much with the writings of Chuang. So I will just go to these discussion questions, and in the process of answering them, we'll get an overview of this Taoist text. So discussion question 1 on page 263. Move this over here a little. Compare the story of Li Qi here with the Buddhist parable of the arrow. Explain the main similarities and differences. All right, so that is a story. It's a beautiful woman. So I'm not sure I'm pronouncing these Chinese names properly, but up at the top of page 259, Mao Xiang and Li Qi were accounted by men to be most beautiful, but when fishes saw them, they dived deep in the water from them. When birds, they flew from them aloft, and when deer saw them, they separated and fled away. But did any of these four know which in the world is the right female attraction? As I look at the matter, the first principles of benevolence and righteousness and the paths of approval and disapproval are inextricably mixed and confused together. How is it possible that I should know how to discriminate among them? So the fundamental question is, what can I know? And the Taoist text here is saying, how should I know? These first principles, these Platonic absolute ideas of beauty. So these humans find these women to be the most beautiful, but fish are terrified of them, so are birds, so are deer. Don't you find these to be beautiful women? Men are attracted, yet these animals flee in terror. So who's to say what's beautiful? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, maybe. Maybe there are no absolute first principles and everything's relative. I don't know. That is what Chuang is saying. Not that there are no absolutes, not that there are absolute ideas. He's saying, how am I supposed to know? So he's taking kind of a middle ground. And the way I would gauge the Taoist texts, if you have the Buddhists or the Hindus on one side who believe in an eternal soul and a personal God, and if you have the Buddhists on the other side who say there is no individual soul at all, and therefore no supreme soul or God, the Taoists would be in the middle, leaning probably toward the Hindus, because although they say it seems to be impossible to know, nevertheless it also seems like there might be some kind of a ruler controlling everything. If you look at the bottom of page 254, he says, if there were not the views of another, I should not have mine. If there were not I with my views, his would be uncalled for. This is nearly a true statement of the case, but we do not know what it is that makes it be so. It might seem as if there would be a true governor concerned in it, but we do not find any trace of his presence and acting. That such a one could act, so I believe, but we do not see his form. He has affections, but he has no form. So true governor and such a one and he, they're all capitalized with capital letters, so that they're implying God. So he's saying, it seems as if there was a God, And that such a one could act, so I believe, but we do not see his form. He has affections, but he has no form. So right there, that's leaning towards the Hindu perspective. He's saying it seems like there is a supreme governor, a true ruler. And and he says, I believe that there is, but where is he? You can't prove it by looking at his form. And and this also brings up an important part of this particular Taoist text, where he says, if there were not the views of another, I should not have mine. If there were not I with my views, his would be uncalled for. So this brings up what could be seen as a controversial opinion, that opposing perspectives create each other, and they are fundamentally the same. And he relates that to the political left and right wing. He says they create each other, they're actually the same. If you look on page 255, in the middle of the page, he says, he thinks that his words are different from the chirpings of fledglings, but is there any distinction between them or not? But how can the Tao be so obscure that there should be a true and a false in it? How can speech be so obscure that there should be the right and the wrong about them? Where shall the Tao go that it will not be found? So a sentence later, he says, so it is that we have the contentions between the literati and the Maoists, the one side affirming what the other denies, and vice versa. If we would decide on their several affirmations and denials, no plan is like bringing the proper light of the mind to bear on them. So the literati and the Maoists, I think that's representing, there were no Maoists in 300 BCE, so I think he's talking about the right wing and the left wing, and he'll mention the right and the left later, so that's what he's trying to talk about. Any two opposing worldviews, it doesn't matter how you categorize them, just opposite philosophies. That's what he's talking about. He says, all subjects, continuing on page 255, all subjects may be looked at from 2 points of view, from that and from this. If I look at a thing from another's point of view, I do not see it. Only as I know it myself do I know it. Hence it is said that view comes from this, and this view is a consequence of that, which is the theory that that view and this, the opposite views, produce each other. A sentence later, he says, the disputants now affirm and now deny, and now affirm. There, the sagely man does not pursue this method, but views things in the light of his heavenly nature, and hence forms his judgment of what is right. This view is the same as that, and that view is the same as this. But that view involves both a right and a wrong, and this view involves also a right and a wrong. Are there indeed, or are there not, the two views, that and this? They have not found their point of correspondency, which is called the pivot of the Tao. As soon as one finds this pivot, he stands in the center of the ring of thought, where he can respond without end to the changing views, without end to those affirming, and without end to those denying. Therefore I said, there is nothing like the proper light of the mind. Okay, so I'm going to compare that last section about the pivot of the Tao in the center of the ring of thought to some verses from the Tao Te Ching, but let's just go back and take in what he's saying here. So he's saying, any two opposing points of view produce each other, and not only that, they change into each other. The disputants now affirm and now deny, and now affirm. What one side champions at one point in time, and the other side will naturally negate it, say that it's wrong. But if you let these worldviews develop in time, they'll flip, and the one will now champion what it formerly was against, and vice versa. That's what he's claiming. It reminds me of an aphorism by Nietzsche, where he says, the moral earth too is round. So if you take any moral perspective and take it to its logical conclusion, it'll turn into its opposite. The psychologist Carl Jung called that process enantiodrama. Just things transforming into their opposites. And so then continuing, Chuang says, this view is the same as that, and that view is the same as this. And you can answer both sides of any debate if you've found their common point of correspondency, which is called the pivot of the Tao, which stands in the center of the ring of thought. So in the video I made about the Tao Te Ching, I equated the Tao with Plato's idea of the good, which I also equated with the cosmological concept of the gravitational singularity, especially the singularity associated with the Big Bang. So the singularity is ubiquitous. It's at every point of space-time, according to the different branches of 20th century physics. But specifically, it's the center of the expanding universe, and it's also contained at each point of its encompassing sphere. As you go out in space, it's like going back in time, and when you get to the farthest reaches of space allowable, where space is expanding at the speed of light, that you go back to the beginning of the universe, which is the singularity of the Big Bang. So reaching far in space implies reversion to the original point. That's one of the verses from the Tao Te Ching. And if you do associate the pivot of the Tao with this original singularity, which is contained at each point of its encompassing sphere, that would help explain how this view is the same as that, and they produce each other, because all points of space and time are contained at each point of this outwardmost sphere of the universe. It's an ancient idea that Leonard Susskind, the Stanford string theorist, and his partner Gerard 't Hooft, they've rediscovered this ancient idea with the mathematical precision of string theory. So if all of space and time are contained at each point of this encompassing sphere, that means also all opposing worldviews are contained and united at each point of this encompassing sphere. If you stand in the center of the ring of thought, if you realize your unity with the source of all being, then you realize your unity with all of the absolute ideas that Plato talked about. All the pairs of opposites are united in that pivot of the Tao. To unite your mind with that pivot would be to unite yourself with both sides of every argument, understanding how they have the same source, and if you follow either of them to their logical conclusion, they transform into each other. That is how I interpret what he's saying here. And considering discussion question 3, how do the ideas here relate to the ideas in the Tao Te Ching? The Tao Te Ching, let me just compare that section from the top of page 256. I'm going to go to, I think it is, let me go back to the Tao Te Ching, page 161. Okay, so page 166, section 25.3, talking about the Tao, which he also calls the Great. So I guess if it's Chuang Zi, I would suppose it's also Lao Zi, although I've always heard it as Lao Tzu. So at any rate, he says, being great implies reaching out in space. Reaching out in space implies far-reaching. Far-reaching implies reversion to the original point. And that original point is the Tao. So reaching out in space implies far-reaching. The farthest you can reach in space from our perspective on Earth is the horizon of the cosmos, where space is expanding at the speed of light. That is also where, going out in space is the same as going back in time until you reach the original point of the Big Bang at that outermost sphere. So I just relate that to the section from Shuangzi about the pivot of the Tao on page 256. So there's one comparison that you can make. Continuing in the Tao Te Ching, on page 168, verse 40.1, he says, reversion is the action of the Tao. Gentleness is the function of the Tao. So reversion, that when you go out in space, you revert to the original point. That's the nature of the Tao. On page 168, verse 42.2, he says, the created universe carries the yin at its back and the yang in front. Through the union of the pervading principles, it reaches harmony. So harmonizing opposing perspectives is one of the main ideas in Chuang's writing. And so I'm just trying to draw some parallels between the two texts. On page 170, on the Tao Te Ching, verse 52.1, he says, there was a beginning of the universe, which may be regarded as the mother of the universe. From the mother we may know her sons. After knowing the sons, keep to the mother. So again, the mother of the universe, if you see that as that original central point, the pivot of the Tao, which is also contained at this outermost sphere, where all space and time are united, and the sons would be the offspring, all these objects in three-dimensional space enduring through linear time. It's better to keep to the original point and the mother of all being, which is the outermost sphere where all space and time are united at each point. That might seem hard to believe that he's actually thinking that it's possible to do that, but as we'll see, he does talk specifically about the sagely man containing all space and all time. It's also important to note the very beginning of the writings of Chuang. There was some teacher whose name, so here's some names on page 253, Nan Kuo Si Ki, I don't know how that's really pronounced, was seated, leaning forward on his stool. He was looking up to heaven and breathed gently, seeming to be in a trance, and to have lost all consciousness of any companion. His disciple, who was in attendance and standing before him, said, what is this? Can the body be made to become thus like a withered tree, and the mind to become like slaked lime? His appearance as he leans forward on the stool today is such as I've never seen him have before in the same position. So then the teacher said, you're right to be amazed. I was in this kind of a trance. So it starts with this trance-like state. And what did the person in a trance experience? If you look on page 259, right after the story of Li Qi, which is the story about the relativity of beauty, the beautiful woman from a human perspective is terrifying to the animals. So the next paragraph, Ni Q said further, since you, sir, do not know what is advantageous and what is hurtful, is the perfect man also in the same way without the knowledge of them? Wang I replied, the perfect man is spirit-like. Great lakes might be boiling about him and he would not feel their heat. The Ho and the Han might be frozen tip and he would not feel the cold. The hurrying thunderbolts might split the mountains and the wind shake the ocean without being able to make him afraid. Being such, he mounts on the clouds of the air and rides on the sun and moon and rambles at ease beyond the four seas. Neither death nor life makes any change in him. How much less should the considerations of advantage and injury do so? And then skipping that next paragraph at the bottom of page 259, he says, how could anyone stand by the side of the sun and moon and hold under his arm all space and all time? Such language only means that the sagely man keeps his mouth shut and puts aside questions that are uncertain and dark, making his inferior capacities unite with him in honoring the one Lord. Men in general bustle about and toil. The sagely man seems stupid and to know nothing. He blends 10,000 years together in the one conception of time. The myriad things all pursue their spontaneous course, and they are all before him as doing so. So the sagely man has all space and all time under his arm, and he sees all things before him. 10,000 years he sees in an instant. So that is an important part of the definition of a self. We saw David Hume, for example, say that that's what you would need to have, those conditions of having all space and time constantly in front of your mind's eye. Unless you had that condition, you wouldn't have a true self. So he says, I'll turn to A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume when he's talking about the identity and simplicity of a self that he doesn't perceive anywhere. He says, because he's an empiricist, what sense impression is related to a self? Here's how he describes it. From what impression could this idea be derived? This question it is impossible to answer without a manifest contradiction and absurdity, and yet it is a question which must necessarily be answered if we would have the idea of self pass for clear and intelligible. It must be some one impression that gives rise to every idea, but self or person is not any one impression, but that to which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression constant and invariable. Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never all exist at the same time. Well, as I pointed out, they do all exist at the same time, at least if you believe people's near-death experience accounts, where they saw their whole lives flash before their eyes. Everyone's heard that phrase. And furthermore, they're traveling. They said, oh, I saw my mind rise above my body. I'm looking down at my body. Then I'm hurtling through space until it seems as if I'm hurtling through a dark tunnel toward a point of all-embracing light. And that is, I've explained before, what general relativity theory says you would experience if you were traveling through space at near the speed of light. All the light from behind you would get pulled into a point at the end of a dark tunnel in front of you. That's how it would appear. So, when you go back to the writings of Chuang, the bottom of page 259, the sagely man holds all space and time under his arm. He blends 10,000 years together into one conception of time. So that is that's what Hume says a self must be. So again, if you're putting Taoism on the scale between the extreme poles of Hinduism on the left and Buddhism on the right, although politically you'd probably reverse that, but at any rate, one side is Hinduism, believes in an eternal soul and God. Buddhism, there's no soul, no God. Taoism seems to be in the middle, leaning towards Hinduism. All right, so let's just go back to these discussion questions. Discussion question 2 on page 263, explain the butterfly passage. So page 261. It's paragraph 11, so I'll read both paragraphs because they're related to each other. So the penumbra asked the shadow. So the penumbra is the outer border of a shadow. So saying, formerly you were walking on and now you have stopped. Formerly you were sitting and now you have risen up. How is it that you are so without stability? The shadow replied, I wait for the movements of something else to do what I do, and that something else on which I wait waits further on another to do as it does. My waiting, is it for the scales of a snake or the wings of a cicada? How should I know why I do one thing or do not do another? Formerly I, Chuang Cow, dreamt that I was a butterfly flying about, feeling that it was enjoying itself. I did not know that it was cow. Suddenly I awoke and was myself again. The veritable cow. I hope that's how you pronounce K-A-U. I did not know whether it had formerly been cow dreaming that he was a butterfly, or it was now a butterfly dreaming that it was cow. But between cow and a butterfly there must be a difference. This is a case of what is called the transformation of things. So when I say cow, I'm saying this person's name, Chuang Cow, not a cow that gives milk. So it's not a cow and a butterfly. It's this man who dreamt he was a butterfly. But then he woke up. But now he's wondering, how do I know for sure that I really woke up? Maybe I'm a butterfly dreaming I'm a man. And there's no certain way to tell if, what is true or what is not. So this is related, this idea of the butterfly passage, which is the discussion question 2, explain the butterfly passage. It's related to the paragraph on page 260, directly on the other side of the page, the last sentence of the top paragraph on page 260, he says, how do I know that the dead do not repent of their former craving for life? So the whole fundamental question of this part 3 of the book is, what can I know? And Chuang is saying, I can't know anything, it seems, for sure. And yet he's implying that there is a possibility of embracing the Tao and understanding all space and time. So that's a little bit of ambiguity there. And I'll go back to talk about comparing the Tao Te Ching to this Taoist text, where they both say you can't express the Tao in words. So it's not that knowledge is absolutely impossible, but even if you could have knowledge of it, you'd never be able to express that knowledge with words. But let me just continue with this butterfly passage, which is related to this idea that we live in a dream. So who's to say that when you die, you know, people are afraid to die, but after death, maybe you say, what was I afraid of? This is the best thing ever. A lot of these near-death experience accounts say that's how they felt. So continuing here on page 260, those who dream of the pleasures of drinking may in the morning wail and weep. Those who dream of wailing and weeping may in the morning be going out to hunt. When they were dreaming, they did not know it was a dream. In their dream, they may even have tried to interpret it. But when they awoke, they knew that it was a dream. And there is the great awaking, after which we shall know that this life was a great dream. All the while, the stupid think they are awake, and with nice discrimination insist on their knowledge. Now playing the part of rulers, and now of grooms. Bigoted was that Kiyu. He and you are both dreaming. I, who say that you are dreaming, am dreaming myself. These words seem very strange, but if after 10,000 ages we once meet with a great sage who knows how to explain them, it will be as if we met him unexpectedly some morning or evening. If you look down further on the page, the last sentence on that paragraph, above the last paragraph, he says, the harmonizing of them is to be found in the invisible operation of heaven, and by following this on into the unlimited past. So if you follow anything to the unlimited past, you end up back at the original singularity, which I keep pointing out because there's so many parallels between that concept and the concept of the Tao. But we live in a dream from which we can awake. He says that in the second paragraph on page 260, and then in the butterfly passage, which is the last paragraph of the whole reading on page 261, he says, formerly I dreamt I was a butterfly. So in the paragraph above that, where the penumbra asks the shadow, why do you move around so much? The shadow says, I'm just waiting for something else to move, which in turn it waits on something else. So that is similar to Plato's cave allegory. You know, we are all shadows of our, you know, the prisoners in the cave, they're shackled head and foot. They're forced to look at the back wall of a cave upon which shadows are cast, shadows of their own bodies and shadows of the puppets that are walked behind them by the guards. So that someone who's sitting there, a prisoner in the cave, who might have that knowledge, would say, you know, I know that these are shadows, but I can't turn my head and see what they're shadows of. So what do I know? All I know is that I'm just a shadow of something else, and whatever that thing is being manipulated by some higher level of reality. It's similar to Plato's cave allegory, as is awaking from a dream. Being in the cave of three-dimensional objects that endure through linear time is like a dream. And to wake from the dream is to come out of the cave and to see the original source of being. For Plato and the Republic, that's the idea of the good. And for the Taoists, it's the Tao. So that's the butterfly passage. You can't be sure at any point whether you're dreaming or awake. And yet, in this Taoist way, although we can't be sure, probably this is a great dream and we can arise from it. So discussion question 3, how do the ideas here relate to the ideas in the Tao Te Ching? So I already went over comparing the passage about the pivot of the Tao, that if you can understand your unity with that pivot of the Tao that's in the center of the ring of thought, you can then answer without end all the questions from people from the left and the right, because you'll see how they correspond with each other in this pivot of the Tao. I compared that to pages from the Tao Te Ching, but there's other similarities that I'll go over. And for example, the very first verse of the Tao Te Ching, which says that the Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao. So page 161, verse 1.1, the Tao that can be told of is not the absolute Tao. The names that can be given are not the absolute names. And we see the same idea expressed in Chuang's writing, the second paragraph on page 258. The Tao that is displayed is not the Tao. But nevertheless, I'll try to give a rough explanation, he goes on to say, of what I mean by the Tao. And another big similarity between the two texts is knowing when to stop. It's a Taoist virtue of knowing when going too far, knowing when to stop before going too far. In that paragraph on page 258 that says, the Tao that is displayed is not the Tao. Later on, he says, therefore, the knowledge that stops at what it does not know is the greatest. If you look on page 256, he says, and I'll read the second to last paragraph, it was separation that led to completion, from completion ensued dissolution, but all things without regard to their completion and dissolution may again be comprehended in their unity. It is only the far-reaching in thought who know how to comprehend them in this unity. This being so, let us give up our devotion to our own views and occupy ourselves with the ordinary views. These ordinary views are grounded on the use of things. The study of that use leads to the comprehensive judgment, and the judgment secures the success of the inquiry. The success gained, we are near to the object of our search, and there we stop. When we stop, and yet we do not know how it is so, we have what is called the Tao. So this idea of knowing when to stop, knowing when to stop asking questions is this Taoist virtue. On page 254, the third from last paragraph, he says, joy and anger, sadness and pleasure, anticipation and regret, fickleness and fixedness, vehemence and indolence, eagerness and tardiness, all these moods, like music from an empty tube or mushrooms from the warm moisture, day and night, succeed to one another and come before us, and we do not know whence they sprout. Let us stop, let us stop. Can we expect to find out suddenly how they are produced? So again, knowing when to stop asking questions, and yet he goes far enough, so you have to know how to push questions just far enough and then know when to stop in order to approach the Tao. And you see that idea of knowing when to stop in the Tao Te Ching. Let me go back to that, page 161. Okay, on page 166, verse 30.3 says, therefore a good general effects his purpose and stops. He dares not rely upon the strength of arms. Over on page 167, verse 32.4, he says, then human civilization arose, and there were names. Since there were names, were well one knew where to stop. He who knows where to stop may be exempt from danger. So knowing when to stop is on page 169, verse 44.3, the contented man meets no disgrace. Who knows when to stop runs into no danger. He can long endure. So I'm just comparing verses from these two Taoist texts to show the similarities between them. All right, discussion question 4 on page 263. Compare the butterfly passage to Borges's two pieces. Explain the main similarities and differences. So, the butterfly passage, which we just read about Chuang Kao dreamt he was a butterfly, and then he woke up. I did not know whether it had formerly been Kao dreaming that he was a butterfly, or it was now butterfly dreaming that it was Kao. How is that similar to Borges's readings. So if you look on page 146, so the two passages, but most of the similarities are with the second reading, where he was writing about, I think, pretending to be Shakespeare, writing about Shakespeare, who had the strange gnawing feeling that he didn't exist, that behind his face there was nothing, so others didn't understand him when he addressed them about that. So he started acting like he was somebody, and then found his vocation of pretending to be someone. On page 145, the last sentence of that first long paragraph, he says, the fundamental identity of existing, dreaming, and acting inspired famous passages of his. For 20 years he persisted in that controlled hallucination. But then one morning he got sick of it and he retired. The last paragraph on page 146, history adds that before or after dying, he found himself in the presence of God and told him, I, who have been so many men in vain, want to be one and myself. The voice of the Lord answered from a whirlwind, neither am I anyone. I have dreamt the world as you dreamt your work. My Shakespeare, and among the forms in my dream are you, who like myself are many and no one. So that is similar to the Taoist text, and I said that during the video about Jorge Luis Borges, that his final conclusion was kind of like the Taoist perspective, not certain, but inclining towards a belief in God and a soul, yet also open to the possibility that it could be like the Buddhists say, and there is no soul, and that there's no certain way to verify one or the other of these opinions. Okay, so that will conclude the Taoist text for part 3 of the book. The next video will be about René Descartes' writings in Meditations 1 and 2.